Hey guys, today we're going to build this awesome grow station that features concrete and wood construction, integrated lighting, and integrated warming pad at the bottom, plus some fun joinery. So let's get going. And first up was the concrete mold. To make it, I'm using some 1/2-inch birch plywood. I know a lot of people use melamine, and that's definitely an option. I just had 1/2-inch plywood in the shop, so that's what I used. So here I'm cutting out the strips that would eventually make the walls of the mold, followed by a panel for the bottom. From there, I marked out the length for the walls and then cut them at the table saw. And all these measurements are covered in the plans for this project, which are linked in the description below for anyone who's interested. With the walls cut down, I could cut the panel to its final length. Next, it was time for assembly. I struck a line about 1/4 inch off the edge, and then used a countersink bit to pre-drill a couple holes before driving in the screws. The heating pad is embedded into the concrete, so I used some 1/4 inch plywood to make a relief that would house the pad. I went ahead and sanded all my pieces down now prior to assembly, just so I didn't have to worry about it later. Then I could mark out the placement for the 1/4 inch pad and apply some glue and put it in place. And if you're looking to reuse this mold, definitely use more glue than I do here. Otherwise, like Carmelo Anthony, it's one and done. If your clamps don't fit, use dumbbells. And to make sure that the cord had a place to exit the concrete, I measured and cut a small strip that I glued onto the edge. To create the mortise for the light stand, I cut a 1-inch block out of some foam insulation at the bandsaw. Now if you don't have a bandsaw, you could always just use a jigsaw, or a pole saw, or even a long razor blade. Next, I laid out the placement for the concrete mortise, which sounds a lot like the name of a heavy metal band. From there, I could mark out and attach the bottom of the mold. And just like the sides, I pre-drilled using a countersink bit and then drove in the screws. Then I applied a liberal amount of paste wax to make sure that the concrete released from the mold. Alright, so next I'm going to take some silicone and I'm going to put a bead all the way around the outside border in the corner, and then I'm going to use this Sculpey tool, split the bead and let it dry, and then we'll come back, remove those pieces, and we'll apply another layer of paste wax before gluing in our little cube here. Doing this creates a nice rounded corner on the top of the concrete edge. Once the silicone had some time to dry, I used a razor blade to scrape off the excess. And because I was on it like a bonnet, I decided to add some more paste wax before hot gluing in the mortise foam. And hey, if you're enjoying this project, give this video a like so it can spread to more people. I really appreciate your support. Next, it was time for the first of 3 concrete pours. Now, I'm using Cementol because it creates a color and a texture that I like, but any quick dry cement would work fine. The mix I'm using here is what's recommended on the box. It's a little thick, but as long as you can spread it all around your mold, I think you're okay. Just make sure to vibrate the mold once you have all the concrete spread. I did so with a dead blow hammer, and you can make a little tune to it too. Alright, so for the final pour I used some self-leveling concrete, and I made sure to level my mold using some shims before I poured it. Skipping this step would result in a pretty wonky bottom for the concrete base, as well as resting failure face, which, let's be honest, nobody wants. And for this batch I did 32 ounces of water for every 10 pounds. The consistency is much thinner than the other concrete, so it levels out well. Now, I haven't made a ton of concrete pieces, so let me know if you have any tips or tricks down in the comments. So while that hardened up, I got to work cutting down some boards to make the panel for my light housing, not the ship guiding kind. Once I had the boards cut to rough length, I went ahead and milled them down to their final thickness, which is just under an inch. From there, it was off to the table saw to cut a clean edge onto the boards. Once I had the board situated in a way that I liked, I went ahead and drew a triangle so that I knew the orientation and glued up the panel. I'm not using dominoes in this panel because A, I'll be milling out the center, and B, it doesn't really need them. After about 15 minutes, I scraped away any squeeze out with a dull chisel. All right, so for the stand, I'm gonna be using some offcuts that I have left over of some 8/4 walnut. We'll leave it a little oversized because we'll finish dimensioning it over at the planer. So once I had my boards cut down to their rough thickness, I used the planer to really dial it into the final thickness. And by this time it had been a few hours and it was time to demold the concrete, which came with its own set of stresses. But honestly, everything started out swimmingly, and then it kind of stuck. But honestly, this is what I was talking about earlier, that if you want to reuse this mold, you should probably use more glue and use some added oil rather than just relying solely on paste wax. So it definitely didn't release as smoothly as I was hoping, but I did eventually get there. And thankfully, it was like Kyrie Irving likes his earth, flat. And hey, if you're watching this video and you're not subscribed, you're just letting a robot decide what you want to watch. So subscribe and don't let Skynet win. Next, I cleaned up the concrete mortise with a cheap chisel and removed the foam insulation. Then from there, I sanded everything down, knocking down the hard edges with a sanding block. All right, so for the light sand, I'm gonna cut a bridle joint at the top, and then we're just gonna cut a tenon, which we'll insert into the concrete in the bottom. So I'm gonna go ahead and mark that out, and then I'm gonna use a dado stack and a tenoning jig to cut out the bridle joint tenon and the miter gauge to cut the cheeks. So let's get started by marking those out. I start by using the stock as a guide to set my depth, and then I mark the tenon cheeks on either side. From there, I measure and set the thickness for my tenon to about 1/3 of the stock's thickness. And while marking these out isn't 100% necessary, it makes it easier for me to visualize what I'm going to do next, as well as align the grain pattern like I want. I set the height for my dado stack by just running my finger across the top of the stock until I can barely feel the tip of the blade. Then aligning the outside tooth to the edge of my markings, I lock the fence and make the first cut. Once I've cut one side, I rotate the piece 180 degrees and cut the other. This way it ensures that the groove is dead center. Next, I cut the tenon following the exact same process of lining up my mark, making the first cut, then rotating the piece and making the second. Now, the tenoning jig did leave me with a small amount of tear out, but luckily I planned for that and used my miter gauge to clean up the cheeks. Next, it was time to measure and mark out the tenon for the stand. And since this could vary a little bit, I went ahead and took the measurements directly from the mortise. Which brings me to a good point. Sometimes you have to let the project in front of you tell you the measurements rather than relying on your plans. Things can move and you have to adapt. So I cut this tenon in the same process as I did the bridle joint, and things were moving in good harmony, like bone thugs. I did cut the tenon oversized, this way I could trim it back, because I left this stick a little long. All right, so next I've got this 1/2 inch board here, and I'm gonna make a box that will contain all of the planters, so kind of hide them on top of the grow station. First, I gotta cut these down in some strips, and then we'll put some grooves in them, cut a couple miters. This box won't have a bottom, so that the warming element will still work. It'll just make those boxes look a little nicer. So with the boards cut to their final width, I set the blade height and cut in the grooves. Then using the miter sled, I cut the ends off one edge before measuring and marking out my final length. To glue up the miters, I went to my trusty old blue tape and squeezed those miters closed. Since these have some fine grooves in there, I was really mindful about the alignment, as well as minimal glue application so I don't have a bunch of squeeze out. Next, I added a round over to all of my parts for the stand. This just classes up the edges and really makes it look like a more finished piece. And I do this with a combination of a woodpecker's easy edge plane and some sandpaper, but you could do this with just sandpaper or a rasp. So next it was time to mill out the center of the panel. And to do that, I'm going to use my X-Carve and a bits and bits compression bit. Now, I understand that everybody doesn't have an X-Carve, so I have in the plans a way you can build this light without using a CNC. Basically, you're going to want to make your panel and glue strips around your panel to create your edge. But if you do have a CNC, the project file will also be in the plans. So since I left the panel a little oversized, I went ahead and marked out the length and cut it down at the table saw. From there, it was on to sanding and rounding over the edges. I didn't worry about sanding the inside to a high grit just because I still want there to be some tooth for the adhesive to grab onto. From there, I laid out the hole for the cable to feed through the panel. Now, this had to be a little oversized because the cable themselves has a larger connector than it does a cable, so I did have to make these a little larger than I really wanted to. Next, I marked out the location on the support to feed the cable through and give the cable management a cleaner look, so I did that at the drill press. And then finally, it was time to get the band back together and glue up the bridle joint. I'm adding a sheet of 22 gauge steel to conceal the heating pad, so I spray painted it orange to give it a little pop of color. In hindsight, I think that copper may have looked a little better, but really that's a personal preference. From there it was on to finishing everything, and for that I used penetrating oil. Oh, and just as a side note, I'll have links to all the items I'm using in this video down in the description for anyone who's interested. And full disclosure, I do get a few pennies if you do buy, but I would never recommend anything I don't actually use myself. So finally it was time to start putting things together, and I started by drilling a pilot hole in the center of the stand to anchor it to the base. Then I added a few felt furniture pads to the bottom so it didn't scratch the countertop. Next I attached the eye hook that would help suspend the light canopy as well as hold the cable. Let's screw in some washers, hold the stand in place. This also makes the stand removable so that if I ever need to move it or pack it up, I can. I attached the lights to the housing using some Starbond CA glue. And if you want to try this stuff out, I'll have a discount code linked in the description. I made a slit in a small gasket and slipped it over the wire, and then glued it on to prevent any light from leaking through the top. Next I placed 4 smaller eye hooks onto the 4 corners of the panel. These will be what I use to attach the wire and balance the fixture. Now getting the wire to the correct length took a little trial and error, but only took about 5 minutes, so hang in there, kind of like that cat. Now this thing came out just as I pictured it, which is awesome because that's usually the goal, but not always the case. The bridle joint looks terrific, the concrete base is amazing, and the light housing looks awesome. I couldn't be happier. Alright guys, that was a ton of fun, and if you like this one, watch this video next, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you next time.